if I say, Ziad, you can use my photograph, and then Ziad uses it in television, I might say, wait, but I didn't say you could use it for commercial use. Or maybe he draws a mustache, and then I say, no, I didn't say you could edit it. So even when somebody says, oh, you can use it, you still have to have some kind of rigorous legal discussion to understand exactly what you mean. So it's actually a very important point that it's important that people want to share, but it has to be very precise from a legal and technical perspective. And so in fact, it's quite similar to these, because before we had many network technologies and we had many bridges, but it still costs a lot of money to connect computers together. And before the web, you could access documents, but it costs a lot of money to actually put a service together, like Google. And similarly, we have the ability to create knowledge and connect people's knowledge together, but technically, it's very, very difficult. And we didn't realize how difficult it was until the internet made it so easy at this layer that now the biggest problem is a legal barrier. And so this is what I would like to talk about. One other key, one of my favorite writers uses this term for the internet, which is small pieces loosely joined. So if you look at all of the great innovations of internet, like the browser was created by a very small team of students at university. Linux was started by Linus Torvalds, and it's a very small project. And if you remember, maybe you don't remember this, but I remember when he posted on this Usenet, I'm going to start an operating system project. It probably won't be that popular, but if you want to help, please join. And the same day, thousands of people started open source projects. And in fact, 99.9% of open source projects fail. But his project was successful, and it was very small at the beginning. And the basic point is that the cost of failure for open source is very, very low, right? And all the pieces start very, very small. And when I work in Japan, I work with a telephone company quite a bit. Basically, they say, unless it's $1 billion market, we won't start a business unit. They cost them about $5 million to decide whether to do the deal. And then it costs them between $10 and $50 million to create the business unit. So their cost of failure to make one swing of the bat is about $15, $20 million. But on internet, with open source, the cost of failure is almost zero, and because most people fail. And then I'm an early stage internet entrepreneur, and I invest, my main companies that I invest are about 3 people usually, and they usually have about 100,000 users, and they're just starting to grow. And my average investment is about $100,000. So my cost of failure is about $100,000, which is still much cheaper than $15 million. And the thing that's very interesting, to go back to the earlier chart, is most of the great applications, eBay, Amazon, Linux, you would never have predicted that you really needed it. So if I was in a big company and I wrote a proposal and I said, I would like to build a browser, they would say, what's the business model? We can't give you $10 million to do this. Most things that we take for granted, like the web, we could never have predicted in a kind of a high cost of failure-based large corporate R&D lab. It would have been very difficult. And the internet is really about testing all these models, connecting them together very loosely with an open standard, and growing. And so another word that I think that we use is called amateur innovation. And again, this is if you take the Latin root, I know Donatella is from Italy. If you go to Italy, or if you go all the way back to Latin, it means, I think, amator means like the love, right? So amateurs are people who are doing it for passion, because they enjoy, right? Not for money. Professionals are people who do things for money. And I think that when the transaction cost was very high, when the cost of creating a television show or broadcasting a television show or even creating software was very high, you had to have institutions to sort of develop the intellectual property and create the software and so on. And so by definition, anyone who was working in the creative industry and the software industry was professional. But when the cost of collaboration went down so much, for instance, I'm on the board of the Mozilla Foundation, and we have Firefox, which is a browser. Or if you look at Linux, most of the people who contribute to these programs contribute online. Their cost to contribute is very, very low. And because it's so low, many of the people who participate are amateurs. And if you talk to somebody who works on Linux, it's not because he can't get a job at Microsoft. It's because he loves Linux. And many bloggers blog because they like to blog, not because they need to make a living on blogging. And I'm not saying that the professional business goes away, but this amateur is a kind of a new workforce. So kind of like we have more and more women joining the workforces in many countries, like Japan also has been very slow in bringing women into the workforce. It's a whole new workforce that's being generated. And I think that this new amateur innovation is an addition, not a replacement for the professional innovation that we have right now. And I think there has been some kind of battle between the amateurs and the professionals. And what I'm trying to do is trying to create a hybrid economy that uses the best of both sides. I know Ziad is going to talk about copyright in a maybe slightly different way, but I will use a few slides to describe what's different about copyright now that we have internet. So now take a book, for example, right? So if this circle is all the things that you can do with a book, most of the things that you can do with a book are unregulated. So for instance, if you buy a book and you read it, or you give it to somebody, or you sell the book, or you use the book for a pillow and you sleep on the book, there's no law that really regulates any of these activities. These are things that once you have as an owner of the book, you're free to do this without any kind of encumbrance. And then there's a small area in the middle of copyright. And this usually has to do with some kind of commercial exploitation. So in the past, before internet, it meant anyone who wanted to make a copy and resell the book, it prevented them from doing that. And this was usually a company-to-company kind of law. It was preventing one publisher from stealing from another publisher, or a publisher from exploiting an artist. And there also was a thin layer where you could do a little bit of copying to quote somebody's book, or in the US they have fair use. But you could copy some of it, but mostly you were not allowed to make copies. But this made a lot of sense because most of the uses of the book were free, and most of the regulated uses were commercial, right? So copying was a very good way to trigger, to be a test about whether this was a commercial exploitation versus a non-commercial use. And the other thing is you couldn't legally control it anyway. So if you wanted to create a law that prevented people from giving away books, it was nearly impossible. So there really wasn't any enforceability in the law anyway. But when we went from analog to digital, the big difference is that because copyright regulates copies as a trigger for when copyright regulation gets involved, in the digital world, the problem is that every kind of use is a copy. When you go to a browser and you look at a book, it's a copy. If I want to give you a copy of my book, it's a copy. If I want to create an index of a book, it's a copy. So every time I read a book, I'm making a copy. So suddenly, this law that only affected commercial businesses suddenly affects every single user of content on the internet. So it's kind of a new thing that users even have to worry about copyright. So now every use requires permission because it's regulated. And so it went from nearly unregulated to almost everything is now regulated by copyright law and is involved. So this is one thing that's very important to remember, is the scope has gotten very large. The other thing is control. So I have this Amazon device called the Kindle, and I can download books, which is great, and I can carry them on the plane, but I can't give them to you anymore. And now Japanese broadcasters are broadcasting, and you can copy them onto your DVD thing, the hard disk, but you can only watch the show 10 times.